Hello, friends. Lacey Camp here. This is No Small Endeavor. You're listening to our unabridged interview with Dr. Alexandra Solomon. She's a lecturer at Northwestern University, a internationally renowned expert relationship, which I teased her about in the conversation. This was a great conversation. I love her book, Loving Bravely. As I say in the interview, it's like she took a compendium of all the things Laura and I learned over a number of seasons of marriage therapy and reading lots of books and working on ourselves a lot, and she kind of condensed it into into all one place. I wish I had known all of this stuff when I was getting married at 23 and Laura was 21. So it's a lovely conversation, a great conversation for February with Valentine's Day. Enjoy, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Dr. Alexandra Solomon is a licensed clinical psychologist, lecturer at Northwestern University, and internationally renowned expert on relationships. She hosts the hit podcast Reimagining Love and has built a global community of over 200,000 Instagram followers by sharing practical tools for relational self-awareness. She's a sought-after speaker and media personality, and she's here today to discuss her book, Loving Bravely. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you for having me, Lee.
Yeah, delighted to have you with us. As I was looking at your bio as a relationship expert, I started thinking about how one of the perennial pitfalls for those of us in theology and or ministry is that, when you have something called a Master's of Divinity or you have a PhD in theology, you're supposed to have answers. And you're also tempted to hide the ways you are so screwed up like everybody else, And so I wonder, man, this must be pretty high pressure in your relationships to be the relationship expert. So how does that work?
So my husband, I've been married for 26 years. My husband's name is Todd, and I've had him as a guest on my podcast a couple of times, and we call them the Toddcasts. And the first time he was on the Toddcast, I had gathered, audience questions, and one of the questions was I want to know from Todd, what's it like to be married to a relationship expert? And he goes, the thing you need to know is she puts on her yoga pants one leg at a time. Yeah, well, I think the difference is that when I do all the things that I teach my couples not to do, I have that running commentary in my head of you got to be kidding me. Don't say that. Oh my God, you just said it. You know darn well that's not the thing to say.
Well, how do you see the work that you've done and the research that you've done, the teaching, the writing, how do you see that flowing out of your own autobiography?
Yeah, I'm the oldest daughter in a blended family system that has known all kinds of struggle over the years. And I think when I was little, I felt really yoked and responsible for the big people's happiness and well-being. And I felt confused and overwhelmed a lot of the time about what I was seeing and noticing and feeling. And at the same time, my safe place was my bedroom. So I developed a thing called preventative homework where I would get my homework done and then I would just, think what else might come up in the day. So I've been always voracious about knowledge and scholarship, both as I think, part of who I am, but also as a coping strategy. Yeah. And so relationship knowledge, I would listen to Dr. Ruth on Sunday nights with my Walkman under my blankets, what is this whole world? And was a huge fan of Oprah and Phil Donahue and all those shows from the beginning. So then when I got to college, I was like, wait a minute, you can make a life, of this. and I think a lot. I put my hand, right here on my heart a lot. And I think about how the young version of me, gets to rest now, because now I'm this empowered woman and I am, I have knowledge and I have experience and I can be helpful to people in a way that when I was little, I just couldn't be. So for sure, I have my mission and my healing and my nerdiness have flown together in ways that are just fit really well for me.
Yeah, it's lovely that you have found your way into that beautiful space. I mentioned to you before we started today, but as I read your book, Loving Bravely, I was thinking back to my lovely wife, Laura, and I have been married well over 30 years now. And we were young and naive and very ignorant of what it meant to be married. When we got married, we were kids. I was 23, she was 21. And then we've done a lot of work on learning to live together well and learning to love each other well. And we've done, 3 or 4 different seasons of marriage therapy. And we've read a lot. We've worked a lot. We've learned a lot from the recovery world. And so it's just been very rich. And as I was reading through your book, I thought, oh my goodness, this is like a compendium of the stuff that we spent years learning in therapy. And so it's just a super helpful book. And I really thank you for the book and all that you've shared with folks that makes this so much, so rich to help people get into relationships.
Thank you. Loving Bravely came out in 2017, and I've since written 2 other books. And that is, when I first became an author, that was the thing that blew me away, was the number of people who said, where was this book when I was 20, and or 25, or when I was first dating, when I was first married. And I do. We don't value relationship and sexuality education, even though we're all alive in a time when the relationship science is rich, abundant. It is, couple therapy, relationship science. These are mature, scholarly fields. We know the stuff that makes a thriving, intimate partnership, yet we don't teach it to young people. It's why I love teaching at Northwestern. The undergraduate marriage class that I teach there, which is really basically a journey into themselves and helping them know themselves more deeply. But you're right. So many of us kind of fumble through and flame out and learn lots of stuff the hard way. And I think even if somebody did have a really robust relationship and sexuality education at 19, 20, 21, you still don't know how to be a married 35-year-old or a married 55-year-old. So we do have to be these forever students, I think, of ourselves, of our partner, of relationships. So yeah, to me, it's a lifelong journey, I'm sure for you, even though you guys, you've been at it for decades, but you don't know Laura in this moment of her life. You've got to get to know her at this moment.
Yeah. That lovely idea of the continued curiosity about who your partner is becoming, I think, has been very helpful to me.
Yes.
You say that early on in the book, you say, quote, "We assume that people ought to just know how to do love, and that's a huge problem." And then you ask, why didn't I put the same due diligence into learning how to do love as I did into learning how to drive? Which I thought was super helpful, but unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah. I have this thing I say now, Disney did us dirty. It's like we grow up on a steady diet, especially I think girls and women, a steady diet of romance and romantic ideas about love should be easy. And if love is difficult, then that means something's wrong. Something's wrong with you, something's wrong with them, something's wrong with this relationship, this idea that if you're my soulmate, I shouldn't even need to translate myself to you. And so I think that's where a lot of the struggles happen by just this kind of argument with reality that we get into of it shouldn't be like this, when in fact, intimate partnership activates the very same deep, strong attachment needs and longings and yearnings that we have when we're babies. That depth of craving for safety and connection has been found in the science. And so we are being activated at incredibly deep levels when we fall in love with a partner, when we become interdependent with somebody else. So of course, it's tumultuous and confusing. And of course, we then need some skills and some faith and some space for mystery and paradox.
Yeah. I've not lectured much on marriage, but in my ethics classes of the years, I typically would have one lecture on marriage that I would give. And I remember that I would typically introduce this, or somewhere in that lecture, I would say something like, I think one of the best things you can do for your future married self and your marriage is to go face your own stuff now.
Yes.
Is that good advice?
It's so rock solid. It's so rock solid. If I was in that lecture hall, I'd be like, woo, yes, that's it. That's it. He's on it. Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. And so you talk about this, you use this term relational self-awareness a great deal. So can you define that for us and tell us how that functions in your work?
I mean, that's it. That's what you share with your students is relational self-awareness.
Okay.
Because it's so darn easy in a romantic relationship. I could sit here and outline for you in alphabetical order or in chronological order all the ways in which Todd Solomon is a real pain in my you-know-what. That's easy. That's easy.
Right.
Being critical of him, saying that he's the one that makes this relationship difficult. It's so easy to see it in him. What the harder thing is for me to study my own reactivity. Why? Why, when he made that comment to me, what was disturbing? It doesn't matter, and I may go to, 4 out of 5 women would find that comment. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What was it about me? So when we're practicing relational self-awareness, we're guided by what I call the golden equation of love. My stuff plus your stuff equals our stuff. Everything that happens in our relationships and our marriages is that choreography or that pattern or that cycle of something from me and my world and my belief system and my experience and my tender spots is getting all tangled up with something about you and your tender spot and your experience, and it's making this dynamic. So we know that we're not honoring relational self-awareness when one of two things is in the room with us, either blame or shame. Because blame is me saying, your stuff is the problem here. If you weren't so X, Y, or Z, we wouldn't have this problem. Shame is when I feel like my stuff is the problem. It's my family of origin stuff. It's my ambition. That's what the problem is here. No, it's my stuff plus your stuff that's equaling our stuff.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Another person I thought of as I was reading through your work is the therapist David Schnarch, who's written a lot of fascinating stuff from my perspective, and a former therapist of mine and now friend of mine introduced me to him.
Yeah.
And I always liked the way, found it helpful. I didn't like it, but I found it helpful when I accepted it. He talks about how what a lot of people call marriage problems is marriage. And that it's the crucible of those challenges and it's the crucible of those difficult times that become the most important moments for our growth as human beings. And I think that just revolutionized the way I thought about marriage and the way I thought about my difficulties in marriage. But I saw at least a analog to that in your insistence or encouragement to see marriage and long-term committed relationships as a classroom of love, where this is where you can really learn to love, right?
Right.
How do you think about that notion of a crucible of love and how, if we can reframe it in a way that we see this as a classroom, all of a sudden it reframes the difficulties?
Yeah. Gosh, that I always have. I have so much appreciation for David Schnarch's book, and if that name is new to any listeners, I really encourage you to dig into his material. He was just made incredible contributions, I think, to our field. And what I always have loved about the idea of a crucible is this idea of transformation. That you are being changed by this experience, almost like worked by the process of loving somebody. And I think there's something that's so, I think, hopeful about that and something really humbling about that. Yeah. I rely on it a lot when I'm talking to people who are dating, because oftentimes, especially today's younger people are going to live through, 3, 4, 5 love stories, that they're not going to get married at the young ages that you and I were when we got married. They're going to have these multiple experiences. And so I tell them, love doesn't leave you where it finds you. And so to let yourself be changed by it and to have some grace with yourself for that. One of my colleagues at Northwestern, Eli Finkel, did some research. He has this idea there is an idea in psychology called self-concept clarity, which is how well do I feel like I know myself? And he did a study where he took a sample of people and looked at them across time, knowing that over the course of the study, some of them would go through a breakup. And what he found, sure enough, was that when people were going through a breakup, their self-concept clarity tanked. It was like they didn't know who they were anymore. And when I read that, I was like, okay, that's it. That fits so well with my sense that relationships change us, and
right.
And certainly a divorce or a breakup is one of those, who am I? Where am I? So I think we have to have that depth of appreciation for how relational we are as people, a relational self. That I'm not just this self-contained Alexandra. I am changing and changed by my relationships, which I imagine there's probably an intersection there with your faith practices too, right?
Yeah. So I'd love to dig into the different parts of loving bravely. And in this first two parts, you talk a lot about self-reflection and self-awareness. And I was reminded a few years ago, we had the psychiatrist Kurt Thompson on our show, and he at one point said something like, I didn't look the quote up, but he said something to the effect of 80% of the time when you're arguing with your spouse, you're actually arguing with your mother or your father, and you seem at least to be pointing in a similar direction. That is that we at least need to be aware of the ways in which our early formation of ourself, we bring that into our marriage. So talk to us some about that.
Yeah. I call that ghost busting. That I feel like a lot of what I do, like in a couple therapy session, right? It's like going slowly enough that we're aware of the ghosts in the room, and that so I think, okay, so what would I want a listener of yours to know, which is that when we go from calm, open-hearted, what I believe to be like our natural state of being, like kind of just in the flow, to tense, guarded, reactive, activated. When that process happens, like that's a moment for us to look at what's being stirred up. And certainly there are lots of times where it's just like our partner is annoying. They left the dish in the sink again, or they, didn't call when they said they were going to call. But there are times when the size of our reaction feels bigger than the present moment. I think that's one of our clues that this moment is being supercharged by something that has to do with our past. It's like our partner has accidentally kind of tripped this wire that is not just the pain of them leaving the dish in the sink, but it activates a really old wound around feeling like my voice doesn't matter, or I'm not taken into consideration, or I'm not safe here. Something that is older and bigger.
How do you go about, or how do you suggest we go about unearthing those ghosts, or unearthing those old patterns that we learned when we were young? If we notice, say, there's this too large or seemingly disproportionate reaction to an episode, how do we then kind of dig beneath that and say, oh, well, that may be X, Y, or Z from my childhood?
I think a lot of it comes from understanding who you were in your family system growing up. Like looking at your family system as, I call it like your original love classroom, because that was the first place that you learned about love. And I want people to think about two different facets: observation and expectation. So observation is, what did you observe? How did the big people talk to each other? Who were women supposed to be in the family? Who were men supposed to be? How was disappointment handled? How was repair handled? Like, what did you observe, right? You had a front row seat. Even if your parents weren't married, even if you grew up in a home with a single parent, you watched that single parent navigate relationships with their parents, with their siblings, with their friends. What did they what did you learn by observing? Because when we're little, we're sponges and we're taking in all these messages about what you're allowed to ask for, how you ask for things, how you handle anger, et cetera, et cetera. So reflecting on those observations you made. And then the second one was the expectations. Who did you have to be in your family? A family is a system. And one of the qualities of a system, whether it's like a pond, like an ecosystem, or a business team, or a family, one of the properties of a system is a system seeks homeostasis. A system seeks stability and balance. And so oftentimes, family systems do that by casting kids into roles. And kids, and when we're little, we become who our parents need us to be. There's a wonderful teacher in my field, Gabor Mate, who wrote a book called The Myth of Normal, and he's written other books. And he says, when we're little, we trade authenticity for belonging. And so we had to become who our families needed us to be. I have actually on my website a family of origin roles quiz. I've kind of broken down the roles that we play in our family into 6 different roles. And on my podcast now, we're digging into all these different roles and looking at what is the wound that emerges when you had to be the perfect one, when you had to be the easy one, when you had to be the peacemaker? What's the wound you were left with? And what's the gift you were left with? Because it's both of those. Right. So those are some of the avenues to understanding how the past shows up today. It's not an excuse. It's not about throwing your parents under the bus. It's not about blaming, but it certainly is about contextualizing ourselves and our partners so that we're less confusing to each other.
Right. Yeah. I'm still ruminating on that quote from your colleague. When we're young, we trade authenticity for belonging.
Isn't that? That just like I still feel the little shivers on my neck when you say it. When you say it back to me, I feel it. It's like it's just so everything to me.
Yeah. It's a remarkable challenge. Then I think at least two potential implications of that is one, as I grow into my own marriage, I want to try to find a way to find my own authenticity and facilitate belonging, and to allow my children to be authentic, which of course is that poses all sorts of challenges, right? Because there's always that. Because as we'll talk about here in a moment, the notion of boundaries and so forth. There's always it seems like there's that tension with our children or with our spouses of how we want them to be authentic, and yet at the same time there are limits to the way they're going to express their authenticity with me or with us. So how do you think about being authentic while still holding on to boundaries or holding on to some sort of expectation of moral formation in our children?
That's right.
Or in one another.
Or in ourselves, right?
Or in ourselves,
I don't get to talk any old kind of way to Todd Solomon and then say, I'm just being authentic. That doesn't work. It's not a free pass, to say, these are just my feelings or this is just me being authentic. So there is, right. I think that is the challenge or the tension. To me, authenticity is less a kind of like fixed state and more noticing I'm biting my tongue, figuring out what I'd like to say and how to say it in a way that's going to pull you closer to me rather than push you further away. And often that has to do with, tone and timing, but it also has to do with me being willing to say, Lee, I've got something I'm sitting with, and I don't know yet what it means, but will you look at it with me? Rather than me saying, Lee, you shouldn't have done that, and that doesn't make any sense, and anybody knows that's not the way to do it. Yeah. I'm just, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the difference. Like, can I bring you something that's not fully formed and that is brought to you in a way that we can sit side by side with each other and look at the thing together?
Right. Another quote from your book that came to mind a moment ago when you were talking is, you had this great line about, say what you mean what you say, but don't say it mean. And I've never heard that last part, don't say it mean. So where'd that come from?
Oh, yeah. This is a really cool therapist that I met along the way who was really helpful to me and to my family. And it was something that she had picked up along the way. Somebody had said it to her. Right. Say what you mean and mean what you say, but don't say it in a mean way. It was really a nice reminder about like that alignment between what's happening inside of you and what you say out loud, but really trying to be mindful that compassion gets us so much further with the people in our lives than anything else does. I mean, shame, we can shame, we can invoke shame in other people and they will change their behavior. Shame's a behavior changer, but it happens more beautifully and more gently and more gracefully when it is done with love, So I really liked that. But that oftentimes means, I feel like I spend a lot of time with my couples in therapy, coaching them around pausing conversations. I think that especially like in our, Western U.S. go culture, this idea that you just got to deal with stuff head on and talk it through and, dig through it. I think there are times when couples go on too long. The conversation goes on too long. It gets like cyclical and redundant and people end up being more polarized. So I'm a big fan of dosing, micro dosing conversation and pressing pause when we get activated and stepping away, coming back, especially big ones and tangly ones and ones that don't have easy, obvious answers. I think that we do better to pause, reflect, come back, try again. I think there's something really loving about that.
Yeah. I mean, it also seems that in so much of this, it's depending on where one is of what direction one needs to lean, right? So, because I'm thinking about how, in one of our seasons of marriage therapy, we were working with the therapist on the fact that I came into our marriage highly conflict averse. Mm-hmm. And for me, love meant being nice, always nice and not getting in arguments and not arguing. And so I would laugh at him and say, I've never had a strong feeling about something that I haven't ruminated on for 2 weeks, and then I might say something. Yes. Whereas my wife, on the other hand, never had a feeling that she didn't voice immediately. And so after doing a lot of therapy, 15 years ago or so, the therapist looked at us one day and she said, she was talking about this dynamic. She said, you guys you started like this in your way of dealing with your emotions and conflict. And she said, and you've worked really, really, really hard. And now you're like this. She said, so you just got to keep going. And so I think that's one of the things that Laura and I both learned is that I had to lean into speaking up. Yeah. Even when I might err on the side of being an ass. Mm-hmm. And she had to err on the side of not speaking, even when that was so counterintuitive to her, because that allowed us to move a bit closer together. But I don't know, commentary on that?
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. I think I'm like thinking of so many different couples in my mind and friends of mine and my own relationship. Yeah. My husband says to me at times, I mean, he's more similar to you. He'll say to me, like, there are things that you say to me that I would never in a million years say to you.
Even though we also multiple times, yeah.
Oh yeah. Even though we've had seasons of couple therapy as well, and I think have made progress. And I think that is in that way, and there's a way in which the two of you are a power couple, you hold the value of discernment for the marriage. You're carrying the torch for like, less is more, mindfulness, intentionality. And your wife is carrying the torch for, whatever, realness, for emotionality, for like vibrance, mm-hmm. for not being, for fearlessness, perhaps,
right, Exactly.
And there's tremendous value in both of those, but it's like, because you are different in that way, it's easy to feel confused. It's easy to feel beleaguered. It's easy to feel imbalanced. For sure. But so many of those, I think about, in my field, they're called dialectics, these kind of like both ands where two things are true at once. For you guys, there's a value on temperance and there's a value on expression. Those are both values. There's so many of those in a marriage. I think one that comes up a lot is there's a value on solitude and there's a value on togetherness. Both of those are really essential to a flourishing life, to use something that I know you are passionate about, flourishing, right? We need solitude and we need connection. But the chances that two people in a long-term marriage are going to want the same amount of connection and the same amount of solitude at the same time, there's so many hurt feelings and dynamics that go along with that tension of when do we collaborate and when do we do things our own way, So, that is... but those differences, what I also know to be true is those differences can get scary. We can start to feel like, are we just incompatible?
Yeah.
I think I know that's where people are so at risk of going, is differences can start to feel so scary and so threatening and so much like I must have chosen the wrong person. So I think a lot of my work is helping people just create more capacity for tolerating these things that can feel, tiring, confusing, etc.
Right. And, for us, it's often been, as we learned more about boundaries, we each could say, okay, I see where you're coming from, but with that particular way of reacting or responding to this, but I need to draw a boundary here. And I just can't go there with you. And, I've done that with her. She's done that with me. And then, even last night in a conversation with one of our sons, she was pushing me to. She said, I need you to speak up more about this situation, and I need some validation about my own experience in this. So we've learned better about how to encourage one another in our respective default modes to lean into what's more constructive for the family system. But it's, again, it's been only through decades of work on this that we've been able to make progress on that.
Right. And by the way, the two of you have never been the parents of three relatively young adult sons. So you're learning on the job also of how do you, and that, my gosh, that we've got young adults a little bit younger than yours, but that's a kick in the booty, isn't it? Like, how do you go from like coaching on the field to coaching from the sidelines to when do you speak up, when do you not speak up? And the chances that both partners, both parents are going to have the exact same sense at the exact same time is like slim to none. And then, the one who wants to speak up thinks the one who wants to be quiet is being neglectful. And the one who wants to be quiet thinks the one who wants to speak up is being intrusive.
Yes, that's right.
It's just interesting. And I was thinking also about with Laura being the one who's a little more, shoot from the hip or speak up. I think when I'm working, especially with a woman who's maybe trying to refine that, who's trying to figure out, I often say like a marriage is improved by the 2 to 3 things that you don't say every day. I think for a woman at times that can be a difficult skill to learn because it feels like self-silencing, and it feels then like she is perhaps doing what the culture has done to her of asking her to quiet down, asking her to be a good girl, asking her to abandon herself to make somebody else comfortable. So I think there can be like I find that there can be like a gendered piece there that can be troubling about how do I as a woman feel empowered, but also sometimes, not say everything on my mind, not insist, let
it's
go
bizarre that you point to that because we've had that conversation just in the last month, twice. So it's fascinating. I'd love to talk a little bit about in your lesson 10 in Loving Bravely, source your life. And so a little bit of background on why I'm so interested in this. In virtue theory, in moral philosophy and virtue theory, there's this commonly discussed dynamic in which growth in one virtue supports growth in another virtue.
Okay.
So I'll call this, for example, the overlapping nature of the virtues. So, for example, if you work on being courageous, that can support your own personal growth. It can support contributions to your community. It can support contributions to your working at justice because you've worked on being courageous. And it seemed to me that this chapter seems to point in a similar direction, that as you grow as a human being, then you're growing in your capacity to be in a healthy love relationship. And that it's the overall, it's a great number of things in your own life, in your personal growth, that if you really do work on yourself, that then allows you to have possibilities for love relationships that you wouldn't have otherwise. But is that accurate depiction of what you're doing in that chapter?
What do you call it in virtue theory? Overlap?
The overlapping nature of the virtue. That's what I call it, at least. I don't know if anybody else.
Nature. It makes so much sense. It makes what I immediately thought of. I just spent last weekend with my best friend. I've had the same best friend for 41 years. And she just came to town for the weekend. And I remember her, I had her on my podcast a while ago, and she talked about how she feels like our friendship strengthens her marriage. And then her marriage, it's just like there's like flow between friendship and marriage. And I often, when I'm getting to know a couple, I want to ask about what their interests, their passions, their work, obviously, their friendships, because rather than those being threats to a marriage, I think in the best of worlds, those amplify a marriage. Like what they do, a success at work then helps somebody feel proud of themselves and aligned and purposeful, and then they feel a bit more, invigorated within their relationship. And I think that idea of the flow between domains makes so much sense. Yes, I do. Anyways, long way of saying it is very hard to imagine a world where somebody is struggling with addiction that is untreated, struggling with mental health challenges that are untreated, and expecting them somehow to create a thriving relationship. Like, how would that even work?
Right.
Or, by contrast, expecting the thriving relationship to be the medicine for the addiction,
Right.
So even though we know the research around specifically, addiction, mental health stuff does show that when that both of those channels, individual therapy and relationship therapy, is the most effective route to healing addiction or healing. But anyways, one, you can't substitute one for the other.
Yeah. Yeah. I just continue to be amazed at how so much work on human flourishing and the virtue traditions insist upon a holistic view of the human being that is not abstracted individualistically from their culture and their context. It's like we have to have these holistic views of ourselves and our holistic view of the way in which our culture and our stories, our narratives, all of this stuff together is inseparable, right? And if we refuse to attend to any one segment, then we're kind of setting ourselves up for some sort of pain in some way, some sort of inhibition to our flourishing. And the more we can kind of take that holistic account, the better. Which I had never heard of this healthy mind platter that you introduced there in that chapter, where they point to, their names what are Siegel and Rock?
Yeah, Dan Siegel.
Yeah, so they point to 7 activities to try to kind of see these as activities that should kind of be in any sort of flourishing life: focus time, play time, connecting time, physical time, time in, downtime, and sleep that nourish then our mental well-being. And I found that very helpful, kind of to think of those as sort of the macronutrients of our lives. And that, again, thinking about how all of that will contribute to flourishing in our love relationships, and the absence of that will contribute to some difficulties in that.
Right. And I think we need to be careful to not be perfectionistic, like, oh my gosh, I didn't have my, connecting time today, and therefore it's all ruined. I think sometimes we can almost like overcorrect and then get really hard on ourselves if we aren't doing everything equally well at all times. But just keeping that big picture idea that these are all, that to your point, that a good life or a thriving life is one that's got these different elements. We can't be giving everything to our careers and expecting, there's a price to be paid when we get skewed too much in one direction, for sure.
Part 3 of your book is on self-expression, kind of helping us think through how personal emotional awareness and communication habits impact our relationships. And one of those lessons there that you point to is learning to be present in our body as a key practice. So tell us more about that.
That's actually my word for 2025 for myself, is embodiment, being more in my body. I think as somebody I'm really comfortable in my head,
me too.
And really comfortable in my heart. So I feel like this is my year for being with my body and trusting my body. And that is, and that ties to everything from, our sexuality, and needing to be in our bodies to be present to sexual experiences with a partner, but then also just noticing the shifts in our body when we're sharing space with our partner. When do we feel ourselves opening up? When do we feel ourselves shutting down? Like, just noticing those shifts and being responsible for them. I think so often we say, you made me mad. But did you make me mad, or was there something that happened in my body in response to what you were saying? And, I'm also responsible for how I respond. Yes, your comment, you made a comment and my body shifted, but that's not justification for responding any old kind of way. There's still, responsibility and accountability then for how I respond back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, again, this is another one of those things that I've learned along the way. And I think that 2 anecdotes from my own life experience in this regard. One, I remember, it's been a long time now, 20, 25 years ago, I was really worked up about something. And I don't have the foggiest idea what it was.
Yeah.
But I called a mentor of mine and told him whatever it was, and he could tell I was really upset. And he said, well, the first thing I would suggest to you is to breathe. And I thought, what? That's what you've got for me? But then I've remembered that for 20 plus years, because I realized, oh yeah, I'm not breathing.
Yeah.
And I have zero awareness of what's going on in my body, and breathing at that moment allowed me to pay attention to my body. And by paying attention to my body, it allowed me to take a beat and to slow down. Right.
Yeah.
And then another thing I learned somewhere along the way in therapy was that, at one point, one of the therapists, when we were in a very tense situation, and the therapist pointed out how I kind of I don't even know the word for it, but I kind of closed my body off
like a collapse.
in the face of conflict. And she pointed that out to me. And again, it was like, I've never realized that, right? And so I think learning to pay attention to my body, I've learned a lot of things about what's going on with me that otherwise I never would be aware of unless I choose to start paying more attention to my body. And then that helps me it gives me more information and data about choices and responses that I can make rather than simply reacting.
Oof. I was doing an episode for my podcast is a blend of conversations with guests and then also these like solo episodes where I just talk through a topic. And I did an episode on when shame blocks repair. That when there's a rift between ourselves and our partner, there's a tension between guilt and shame. You know, guilt, if I do something that hurts Todd's feelings, it is adaptive for me to feel guilty, right? Because guilt is an energizing emotion. It will motivate me to apologize, to be curious, to make repair. Shame is a hall of mirrors. You know, shame is me just believing that I am bad. You know, guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. And it's that collapsed posture, you know, like that's what my body does in shame. And one of the things, I was reading some research as part of this episode, and I was reading about this idea that like when we're in shame, one thing we can do is adjust our bodies, you know, like lift up our sternum, roll our shoulders back. That actually helps us move from shame. Like we think like when I feel less shame, my body will shift. But it's actually the shifting of the body that also moves us from shame into guilt so that then we can make a step towards repair. It's really interesting. I was like, right, the arrow goes in both directions. You know, the shame collapses us, but then, you know, the expansion can help us shift our emotions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super helpful. So in thinking about further on self-expression, you talk a bit about differentiation. Could you, for those for whom that's a new concept, could you describe that and the importance of that?
That's all David Schnarch. David Schnarch really built his theory, his ideas about marriage on the concept of differentiation, which is an old school idea from Murray Bowen, who was a family therapist back in, I don't know, the 1960s or 70s, perhaps. Differentiation is our ability to hold the tension between connection and autonomy. Like where we kind of have one foot in both worlds, where I am separate from you and connected to you. So if I've got both my feet in separateness, I'm like, it doesn't matter what you think of me, it doesn't matter what you think, I'm my own person, you know, I'm just focusing on my perspective and my ideas. And that's not particularly healthy for our relationships.
Yeah.
But both feet in connection also doesn't do us any good either. To be both feet in like, I'm only okay if you're approving of me. I'm only okay if you're okay. You know, I don't know where I end and you begin. So differentiation is that kind of healthy, breathy space where we are both our own person and connected. Dan Siegel, who did the Healthy Mind Platter, he calls it the MWE, like MWE, like the me plus the we, that there is that like both and space of connection to other and connection to self.
Yeah. I don't know if Schnarch did this or not, or just my therapist taught me this, but I'll do this sometimes with students and say, you know, stand up, face the other person and put your hands together between you. And then go back as far as you can with your feet. Each of you go back with your feet. And so you're kind of holding each other up, but it's very unstable, and if one falls, the other's going to fall. And whatever happens to the one happens to the other, and representing this kind of emotional enmeshment. But then if you kind of move towards each other, where you're both standing upright on your own 2 feet, you can choose to come closer to each other, or you can kind of move back from each other as you need to, but you're connected. You're still connected. Even if you kind of move back a little bit, you're still connected. And I find that a very helpful picture of what I understand him to be saying with differentiation, is that avoiding that emotional enmeshment then allows us a more mature connection that then is much more fruitful, rather than this kind of, unhealthy notion of being one. Which reminds me as well, I think, and I would love to hear your take on this, I have seen repeatedly in theological justifications, I guess I'll call it, which I think are very poor theological justifications. But a lot of times people in the Christian tradition I've seen talk about marriage and oneness in such a way that I actually think is emotional enmeshment rather than a healthy kind of differentiated oneness. But I don't know, comments or thoughts on that?
Oh, that's really interesting. You're right. Oneness be interesting to trace the origin of that idea, but certainly is one. When I think about oneness, two becoming one, I also think of theology. Like that puts me in a space of like thinking about religion. It makes me think about the Jewish. I converted to Judaism about a year before I married Todd, and I remember learning along the way about that definition of soulmates, where the idea, I think, there is an idea in Judaism about before we're born, we are one, and then we kind of the soul splits into 2 bodies, and then when the people find each other, like that's your soulmate because you were previously one soul, which is a similar variation on that idea of oneness.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, can there be a space for? I do think when we fall in love and build a life with somebody, like there is this thing we've created together.
Right.
There for sure is a Lee and Laura. There is a thing that that the two of you have created and have nurtured for decades and decades. But it doesn't replace the Lee. It doesn't replace the Laura.
Right.
But you're right. I think as part of that Disney did us dirty that we were talking about at the beginning, that is like. That is the idea that that's how it should feel, that there ought to be no boundaries, there ought to be no misunderstanding, there ought to be no loneliness. I think there is something like that we're seeking. Susan Cain wrote about this really beautifully in her book, Bittersweet. She's just, I have so much respect for her as a thinker. And she's
the author who wrote the book on introversion?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Quiet, is that the name of that book?
Yeah. Yep. She really looked differently at romantic love and was like, I think what we're craving in romantic love is the same thing we're craving in spiritual traditions, which is that, the connection to God and to spirit and to oneness. And she was really like, let's stop trashing that or saying it's silly, because it is just us trying to get a glimpse of something where we transcend our own like essential aloneness to feel something that is bigger than us. And so what if romantic love is a conduit of that? And what if we can't always feel it every moment of a marriage, but what if we can cultivate opportunities to feel that like transcendent, whether it's when we're making love or sharing a joke or reminiscing about something or having an experience together where we just feel that like sense of, transcendence,
Yeah.
So those are a few thoughts. Where does it take you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, I find the way you describe that quite helpful. I mean, I think that we've worked really hard on trying to figure out how to be our own selves, and then how to have this sort of deep connection with one another. And, and I certainly, I still get surprised sometimes about how deeply, cast a gaze upon my wife and realize how deeply affectionate I feel towards her in a way that's just, I do think it's a kind of transcendent reality to that. But for us, at least, that's come not in spite of us learning to be our own healthy individual selves, but has been facilitated by that.
Yeah.
Because we still have our own agency. We honor one another's agency. We honor one another's, our own individual pursuits, but then try to protect and honor this space that we have between us. It's very beautiful that we get to have and enjoy.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really touching, and I get that. Yeah, that's cool.
So on self-expansion, part 4 of your book, a couple of things as we get closer to the end of our time together. On apologizing, key elements of an apology. I think one place I want to start with the conversation about apologies is, why in the heck is it so hard to apologize?
Oh my gosh, I know. I was like, do I have to write this chapter? Because it's taken me a lot of years to get better at my apologies. I had to learn from my husband that you don't even get partial credit, if you roll your eyes and jut out your hip and say, I'm sorry. Like, you don't even get partial credit for that stuff. So yeah, it's brutal. Is there any kind of psychological theory behind why it's so hard to apologize? I think it's different things for different people. I know for me, it's because it's taken me a long time to learn the difference between guilt and shame.
I would agree with that for myself as well.
Yeah. So we don't apologize because we're defending ourselves against the god-awful feeling of shame.
Right.
I think we don't apologize because if we apologize, that means we acknowledge we did something wrong. And if we acknowledge we did something wrong, then maybe the other person is going to really think less of us and leave us,
Yeah.
I think we're trying to scramble to prevent all kinds of things we imagine are going to be awful. But it turns out, the awful thing is like leaving our partner feeling invalidated, and kind of like sometimes crazy, right? Like crazy for like, but I know my feelings are hurt. I know that's not how you want to be as a person. So just freaking apologize already.
Yeah. I think that as I grew in learning to deal with shame and seeing the distinction between guilt and shame, and then read some of Brene Brown's work and where she talked about how, shame is correlated with all of these very destructive things, of bullying or addiction or, and all this kind of self-destructive stuff. And that counterintuitively, a strong sense of guilt is positively correlated with things like growth and the capacity to deal with resilience and so forth and so on. And I think once I got better at having a sharp distinction between shame and guilt, it allowed me to start apologizing more sincerely and more quickly. And it also allowed me to be more confident in being able to ask people professionally, say, how I could do better in my work. Give me feedback on that. How could I have done that better? What worked well, what didn't work well? And then to get that kind of stuff, because now all of a sudden I saw a strong sense of guilt of there simply being some sort of objective standard that we're trying to strive towards and to grow into as a gift to me rather than something that threatened my sense of self. And so that was a huge gift to me.
Yeah.
In that regard.
That's great. I love it.
What about apologizing? Give us a quick primer on key elements of making a good apology.
Yeah, the key elements are avoiding passive voice. I'm sorry that you were hurt. No, it's I'm sorry that I hurt you. Avoiding a but. I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, but you did that other thing. I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, but I was really tired. Like the but just negates everything that came before. I think pairing it with a question, I'm sorry. And then, do you want to tell me more about the hurt you're feeling? Like just making sure that you're really open to hearing about the hurt. Sometimes there is no amends action, but I think sometimes there can be an amends action, like making sure that the apology is also paired with a conversation about how might we prevent this going forward, or what am I going to take away from this and do differently? The idea of like the best apology is changed behavior.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's not necessary, but sometimes that is kind of connecting this incident to other incidents and talking about what's a shift that might be necessary here.
On presence, importance of being fully present. This is, obviously so increasingly difficult in the distracted world in which we live, but what's some tips in that regard?
Don't fub.
Don't fub?
Yeah. Fubbing is PHUB, like a fub. Fubbing is phone snubbing. Fubbing.
I've never heard that. Of course, I don't use this. I don't use a cell phone, so I'm not into all the cell phone stuff.
You wouldn't.
Yeah,
you wouldn't fub. You don't
I
even
love
fub.
that.
Yeah, because
now I can tell people, stop fubbing me.
Stop fubbing me, right? But the tricky thing is that when I have my phone in my hand, I'm really sure that I can listen as well. I can like scroll and listen to my husband, but I can't, right? The research shows I can't. But inside of me, like phenomenologically, I feel like I can,
Yeah.
But by contrast, when he's looking at his phone, I feel disconnected. I feel offended. I feel devalued. I'm really sure he can't listen to me as well as if he had his phone down. So I think that couples and actually families as well need to decide, is it phone time or is it conversation time? Because we really truly can't do both at once. And we now have plenty of science that backs that up. So as to your point, presence is harder than ever, likely more important than ever, and totally doable. We are humans. We are wired for presence, but we have to get the phones even just like out of our hands,
Right.
Even a phone flipped over on a table compromises the quality of conversation, it has been found.
Yeah,
So,
I know. I feel like even the phone turned upside down, as you said, at a table, it's still a third presence, right?
Totally. Because it could go off at any moment.
And we're all waiting to see if it's going to go off or not. And then to see what the other person's going to do if it does go off,
Right. Or I'm just aware of it. I'm aware that there's something I could be doing. There's a whole bunch of things happening inside that tiny rectangle that I could be, looking at. So,
So self-compassion, we've had Kristen Neff as well on our show. And I saw that you engage her work on, and you connect self-advocacy and self-compassion, which I find interesting. So talk to us about that just a little bit.
Yeah, you've worked with Kristen. You know how vital self-compassion is, and I think that is, it's not about letting ourselves off the hook. It's not about making excuses. It is treating ourselves lovingly so that we can ask for what we need, so that we can be agents of our relationships. And boy, it's really hard. I know the days when I struggle with my own self-compassion, I am much more likely to interpret my husband's neutral comments as criticisms. Something that is truly neutral will land to me as critical because it feels like he's doing to me what I've been doing to me. So my own self-compassion practices are really helpful to our relationship.
Yeah. And again, I think that relates to the way a lot of times theologically in the Christian tradition, the strong emphasis upon service to another person and that love is service to another person, but overlooking, that Jesus talks about the two great commandments, citing Torah, is love of God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And it's that learning to love ourselves well, I think we can overlook, right? If I don't know how to love myself well, I'm not very good at loving other people.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things you're pointing us to here.
Yep. That's great.
Yeah. Last question that you kind of close us out with maybe some encouragement with regard to perseverance and resilience. If somebody's listening and they think, that's just too much stuff to do, I can't even begin to make my way into these practices, what kind of closing encouragement would you give us to lean in and keep working at it?
Well, first, self-compassion. I think sometimes these, I would imagine if somebody has had like some light bulb moments, even listening to this conversation, can you hold those as insights and invitations rather than taking them and beating yourself up for all the times you didn't know what you're starting to know now? So that would be one thing, is to really like eyes on the horizon rather than, look in the rearview mirror, and to know that you get to begin anew, again and again, and that we have to, right? I think you and I have been really open in this conversation about our years of self-work and relationship work, and still our screw-ups and our foot in our mouth. And so that's why the pieces about apology and forgiveness are really essential. And then, and I guess I think also to hold on to how much courage there is in looking at the impact of the past, your own past, your own pain, the things that you didn't get when you were little that you really needed. And to know that it doesn't matter if you're 30 or 50 or 70 and reflecting on that stuff. It matters, and it's incredibly liberating to look at your story and what you've lived through and figure out what you want and need now in this moment.
Been talking to Dr. Alexandra Solomon, host of the podcast Reimagining Love, and today discussing her book, Loving Bravely. Alexandra, thanks so much. This has been a great conversation, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
I have as well, Lee. Thank you so much. You're a wonderful conversation partner.
Thank you. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.